Good morning, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here in beautiful Quebec and to participate in this very exciting gathering. What I'd like to do today is share with you a little about my experience as the first chair of the California Health and All Policies Task Force, how we approached health and all policies, which I will now call HIAP, and then draw on that experience to raise a few really broad questions that I think are relevant as we move forward to try and expand the use of health impact assessment and build health and all policies and address the implementation gap that Dr. Stahl mentioned. The conceptual underpinning of our HIAP work in California was the understanding that the social, physical, economic, and services environments in which people live, work, study, and play are determinant of their health choices and health outcomes, that these environments are largely shaped by decisions made outside of health agencies and other sectors, such as transportation, agriculture, labor and employment, education, parks, energy, etc., and that some of these decisions have resulted in persistent social and health inequities in vulnerable communities with few resources for health and with significantly unfavorable health outcomes. California's formal health and all policies work began as an outgrowth of discussions about the relationship between obesity prevention and several climate change initiatives that were going on in the state. These discussions occurred against the backdrop of a very significant rise in the use of health impact assessments in the state, led by people in this room like Rajiv Bhatia and Jonathan Heller and others, and a coordinated effort by California's local health departments to try and figure out how to address health inequities by focusing on the social determinants of health. But it also occurred against a backdrop of a long history of intersectoral action for work in public health that I think it's important to remember, because even though health and all policies is a relatively new phrase, public health has actually worked cross-sectorally for years. For example, with car seats, with our Safe Routes to Schools programs, with the tobacco control efforts in the beverages and hospitality industries. And I think that that backdrop is a good precursor to bringing in the concept of formal health and all policies. And of course, we drew very heavily on the work of our colleagues, and I have to admit that many of you know that in the US, we often work very insularly compared to the way people in the rest of the world work. And I hadn't heard of the term health and all policies until I read the manuscript that Dr. Stahl edited, and that led me to the work of our South Australian colleagues and enabled me to put forth the concept of health and all policies, which ultimately led to the inclusion of health and all policies as one of a half a dozen initiatives that came out of a summit on childhood obesity prevention that Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger convened in November of 2010, the highlight of which was a discussion between him and President Clinton. On the eve of the summit, the governor issued an executive order that created the Health and All Policies Task Force and established the task force under the auspices of the Strategic Growth Council, a cabinet-level body that was legislatively mandated to coordinate efforts to protect environmental quality, conserve natural resources, and combat climate change. The task force was charged with identifying priority programs, policies, and strategies to improve health while promoting the other goals of the Strategic Growth Council. The task force is comprised of representatives of 18 very diverse agencies and is facilitated and staffed by the California Department of Public Health. We defined health and all policies as a collaborative approach to improving the well-being of all people by incorporating health considerations into decision-making across sectors and policy areas. The specific charge of the task force to improve health while advancing the Strategic Growth Council's broad environmental, infrastructure, and climate change goals, and the requirement that our initial report, quote, describe the benefits for health, climate change, equity, and economic well-being of any recommended strategies, led us to pay great attention to the concept of co-benefits and to prioritize recommendations and approaches where we could identify a very clear nexus between health and the goals of other agencies. In other words, to really focus on win-win strategies. The task force was required to come up with its initial report and recommendations on a very short timeline. So our first challenge was really to create a sense of common purpose among a group of agencies and people who generally operate in their own silos and focus on their own mandates, and also to generate enthusiasm within the task force and externally for the whole concept of health in all policies. We met as a whole on a monthly basis. We met one-on-one with each agency for at least 4 to 6 times, trying to understand their goals, priorities, challenges, context, fears, stakeholders. We met with stakeholders, academic experts, NGOs, health and equity advocates. We convened an ad hoc advisory committee of health and equity advocates. We held 8 public workshops, and we did a lot of reading. And through this process, the task force agreed on a definition of a healthy community that really helped guide the subsequent discussions about what we wanted to recommend. And also, we agreed on a set of what we termed aspirational goals. We used root cause mapping exercises to explore the role of many different agencies in attaining these goals. And as Dr. Drora noted last night, many people, not just those of us that work in health, really care deeply about health. We found that the task force members became extremely enthusiastic as their understanding deepened as to how their agencies could simultaneously promote healthier communities and advance their own mandates while trying to attain these aspirational goals. Our initial report focused on 6 policy areas that are shown here and included 34 recommendations, but those were whittled down from about 1,200 suggestions as to what we should focus on that we received from our meetings and our public workshops. We used a very informal process to apply criteria such as population health and health equity impact, co-benefits, feasibility of state agency action, strength of evidence, opportunities for collaboration, and so on. The Strategic Growth Council accepted this report, but asked that we come back with a much shorter list of recommendations, and the task force narrowed down to 11 recommendations, developed implementation plans for each, and is now working on the actual implementation. So with that brief background on the California Health in All Policies Task Force process, I'll turn to some of my thoughts and questions related to moving forward with Health in All Policies and HIA. For me, the overriding goal of our work with the task force was to figure out how to embed health in all policies in the operation of California state government, how to spread that concept to local and regional government, which is actually where a lot of policy is implemented, to build mechanisms to institutionalize the consideration of health and decision-making as a routine component of how government works, and to build public and policymakers' support for HIAP to achieve those other goals. But there's a risk that in striving to make health central to many decision-making processes, others will think that we in health are inadequately respectful of the importance of their goals and mandates, or that health agencies are trying to exert too much power, what some have termed health imperialism. How do we best advance HIA and health in all policies without alienating the partners on whom we actually must rely to implement health on all policies? In our work in California, we felt that the best way to ensure our long-term success was to put a lot of energy into building trusting relationships with and among our partner agencies, to listen carefully to their concerns and needs, to make decisions on a consensus basis, and to refrain from imposing our agenda on unwilling partners. But how do we decide when collaboration needs to take a back seat to health concerns, and how do we both attain and appropriately use power to protect and promote health in the policy arena? This question incorporates issues both of authority and accountability that Dr. Stahl also raised and that we will need to address. Several key agencies on our task force expressed great concern and many reservations about the use of HIAs, largely related to issues such as the effects on project costs and timeline, fear of, quote, abuse of the process by dueling advocates, and legal issues. These concerns weren't for the most part based on any actual experiences with HIA, but I think related to feelings about the sometimes cumbersome environmental impact review process embedded in both U.S. federal and California state environmental protection laws, both of which parenthetically already do require consideration of health impacts, although those requirements are rarely addressed. Because of these agency concerns, in our work in the task force, we stayed away from the use of the term HIA. We talked about incorporating health and health equity perspectives, using a health lens, embedding health in decision-making, integrating health analysis. The only recommendation that explicitly uses the term HIA is one that suggests that we identify a range of methods, parentheses including HIA, for incorporating health perspectives. I think there's a definitional issue here that we need to address. What is the difference between HIA, health lens analysis, health analysis, or incorporating health perspectives? It's clearly not feasible to conduct formal, structured, full-blown HIAs on but a fraction of the policy decisions that are made in government. And the policy process itself often precludes anything but the most hurried assessment of health impacts. When health experts share information with colleagues in other agencies, whether it's completely informally, through comments on rulemakings, or through participating in advisory committees or any of the other mechanisms that Timo mentioned, don't we have to in some way, even very informally, conduct an HIA? I say yes. I think at the least we need to use our expertise bolstered by evidence to consider whether the issue merits our input, to assess what we want to comment on and the scope of those comments, to evaluate and analyze the health impacts and make some judgments as to their likely direction and magnitude, to make recommendations to optimize health outcomes, and to determine whether our efforts had any effect. But aren't those the steps of an HIA? So I think we need to think through when and how more formal and structured HIAs are the most appropriate method for informing health and all policies, and how to ensure that our health and all policies input to the policy process, absent a formal HIA, is grounded in evidence, credible, and doesn't neglect key issues. We also need to think about how to decide when it's time to stop doing HIAs and start pushing for actual policy related to what we've learned from a series of HIAs on a particular issue. How do we deal with what appear to be conflicting policies? For example, the California Air Resources Board issued guidance that new housing should not be located within 500 feet of a busy roadway based on very good evidence of the adverse health impacts of living near freeways. But California's transportation and planning agencies have mandates to promote transportation-oriented development in order to reduce vehicle miles traveled and thus reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that TOD, transportation-oriented development, supports physical activity through encouraging active transportation. But many proposed TOD sites in California are located right next to freeways. And our housing agency expressed great fear that the Air Board guidance was reducing the feasibility of attaining their affordable housing goals, particularly in Southern California. Air quality, reducing greenhouse gases, increasing active transportation, affordable housing. We've had dozens of hours of discussion about how to harmonize these goals, all of which are very important for health. How can health and all policies and HIA help better understand how to balance apparently competing goals to optimize health both across the population and within subgroups? We felt that it was very important to provide opportunities for community and stakeholder engagement. in our health and all policies process in order to make sure that our recommendations addressed real problems in a way that made sense to people on the ground and that we didn't miss critical issues. For example, it took us quite a bit of discussion to get our other agencies to understand the relationship between violence prevention and increasing active transportation. But actual community engagement is hard. It takes a lot of time, and some of our agency partners were very reluctant because of concerns about whether it would simply provide an opportunity for advocacy groups to bash government, which had been some of their experience of what was in fact not what we consider community engagement. I think this issue is closely related to the critical issue of equity, but since there are several sessions devoted to HIA and equity, I won't talk more about that right now. It's really easy for us as humans to focus on the things that are right before us, that are easy for us to grasp, and to pay less attention to more remote risks. For example, climate change, in my view, is undeniably the greatest and most urgent public health issue of this century, and all of us in public health have a responsibility to promote policies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I worry personally about whether when we focus our attention on more immediate health risks, for example, the health risks associated with wind energy or biomass or smart meters, how do we make sure that we are not undermining our longer-term goals? For example, our goals to ensure that our grandchildren have a planet capable of sustaining human life. And finally, I just returned from a few weeks hiking in the backcountry of the Sierras, and that can make one feel very small. And as I sat looking at these really awesome mountains, I couldn't help but wonder, suppose we had had a robust health and all policies program in place when the U.S. government first embarked on building our national highway system, or that we'd had a systematic way to conduct health impact assessments when our government first instituted subsidies for corn farmers. Would we have been able back then to foresee the huge health impacts of those policies? I'm not sure. We all understand how important it is to expand our assessment of the health impacts of policy decisions across the spectrum of our complex, globally interconnected societies. But I hope that as we strive to implement health and all policies and to expand the use of health impact assessments, we can find a way to do so with great humility. I want to thank the Health and All Policies team at the Public Health Institute, the Health and All Policies Task Force, the California Endowment for its generous support of the HIAP Task Force, and again, the conference organizers, and I look forward to talking about these questions with all of you. Thank you.